In the shadow of ancient stones where desert winds whisper secrets older than Christianity itself, 9 knights knelt in a circle that would reshape the destiny of 2 civilizations. But what if everything you've been told about their holy mission was a carefully constructed lie? What if their true purpose was not to protect pilgrims, but to plunder the mystical treasures of pharaohs who had been dust for 3,000 years? Picture this: Jerusalem, 1118. The city still bears the scars of conquest, its stones stained with the blood of 3 faiths. In the ruins of Solomon's Temple, 9 French knights swear an oath that history records as noble and pure. But in the shadows beyond their torchlight, other figures watch men whose knowledge stretches back to the time when gods walked among the pyramids, when magic flowed through amulets of gold and jewel, when the dead spoke through objects that held the very essence of immortal power. You see, what the chronicles never tell you is this: the Knights Templar didn't just stumble upon wealth and influence through battlefield prowess and banking innovation. They discovered something far more valuable, far more dangerous. In the buried vaults beneath Jerusalem and the hidden chambers of Alexandria's lost library, in the secret workshops of Cairo's most mysterious craftsmen, they found the magical objects of ancient Egypt, artifacts so powerful that they could grant their wielders abilities that seemed divine. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. There weren't 9 knights in that founding circle. There were 10. The 10th figure stood apart from the others, hooded and silent, his face hidden in shadows that seemed to defy the torchlight. While his 9 brothers spoke their oaths aloud, pledging to protect Christian pilgrims and uphold the glory of God, this figure remained mute. His oath was different. His mission was separate, and his very existence would be erased from every record, every charter, every chronicle that survived the centuries to follow. History would call them the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. But those who knew the truth called them something else entirely: the seekers of the ancient powers. And the 10th man? The one who would become known in whispered legends as the 13th knight, though, officially, he was never counted among their number. He was the key to everything. Let your breathing slow as you settle into this revelation. Feel the weight of nearly 1,000 years of deliberate deception pressing down upon your understanding of history. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of medieval warriors or religious devotion. This is the story of how 9 men were manipulated into becoming the greatest treasure hunters in human history, and how one man orchestrated it all while ensuring that his name would be carved out of existence with surgical precision. Before we descend deeper into this labyrinth of secrets and ancient magic, take a moment to understand why this matters. The Knights Templar became the most powerful military and financial force in medieval Europe. They invented modern banking. They influenced kings and popes. They amassed wealth that made monarchs jealous and afraid. And all of it, every gold coin, every castle, every privilege granted by grateful rulers, all of it was built on a foundation of Egyptian magic that should never have left the tombs. Where it was buried, the year is 1118. And Jerusalem burns under a sun that has witnessed empires rise and crumble like sandcastles before the tide. Hugues de Payens stands before his 8 chosen companions in the ruins of what was once Solomon's Temple, the holiest site in all of Christendom. He is a man of noble birth but modest means. a veteran of the First Crusade whose eyes have seen horrors that would break lesser men. But Hugues isn't thinking about pilgrims or piety as he prepares to speak the words that will bind these men together. He's thinking about the dream that came to him 3 nights ago. The dream where a figure in robes the color of desert sand showed him chambers beneath this very temple, chambers filled with objects that glowed with their own inner light, objects that whispered promises of power beyond mortal comprehension. He had dismissed it as fever, as the madness that sometimes grips men in this harsh land, until he woke to find a small statuette on his bedside table, a figurine of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And when he touched it, knowledge flooded his mind, knowledge of where to dig, what to seek, and most importantly, who could help him understand what he would find. That's when the 10th man entered his life. No one knows where he came from. Some of the knights would later swear he was Egyptian, others that he spoke with the accent of Byzantium, still others that his features suggested ancestry from lands even more distant. The truth is that he seemed to shift like smoke, his appearance changing depending on who looked at him and when. Only one thing remained constant: his eyes, dark as the void between stars. They held knowledge that made even the bravest knight feel like a child stumbling in the dark. He called himself many names, but the one that stuck in the knight's memories was simply the Guide. He came to Hugues with an offer that seemed too extraordinary to be real. He knew where the true treasures of Egypt lay hidden. Not gold or jewels, though there would be plenty of those, but objects of power, amulets that could protect a man from any blade, scarabs that allowed their bearers to understand any language, ankhs that could heal wounds that would otherwise prove fatal, and most precious of all, the sacred texts that explained how to use these artifacts without losing one's soul to the ancient powers that animated them. The pharaohs knew secrets that your church has forgotten, the Guide told Hugues. During their first meeting in a tavern that smelled of wine and desperation, they understood that the world is not merely physical, that there are forces and energies that can be harnessed by those with knowledge and courage. Your crusaders conquered this land, but you have no idea what truly lies beneath your feet. The Christians, the Muslims, even the Jews, you all fight over the surface, while the real power sleeps in chambers that predate your religions by millennia. Hugues should have walked away. Any reasonable man would have dismissed such talk as the ravings of a madman or the trap of a devil worshipper. But he couldn't forget the statuette, couldn't deny the knowledge that had flooded his mind when he touched it, and he couldn't ignore the hunger that had awakened in his heart, not for gold, but for something far more intoxicating, the hunger for power itself. The Guide laid out his proposal with the precision of a merchant discussing trade goods. He would show Hugues and his chosen men where the Egyptian artifacts were hidden, both here in Jerusalem and in the deserts of Egypt itself. He would teach them how to use these objects safely. He would even help them create a cover story that would allow them to excavate these sites without attracting unwanted attention from church authorities who would burn them as heretics if they knew the truth. In exchange, the Guide required only 3 things. First, absolute secrecy about his involvement. Second, a share of the artifacts they recovered, not the most powerful ones, but enough to serve his own purposes, which he declined to explain. And third, the most unusual demand of all, he insisted that when they formed their order, when they took their public oaths and established their official brotherhood, there must be 9 and only 9 knights recognized. He himself would be the 10th, the hidden one, existing in the shadows between official history and forgotten truth. Why? Hugus demanded. Why must you remain hidden? The guide's smile was cold as winter stone. Because, my friend, there are forces in this world that have been searching for men like me for a very long time. The church calls us heretics, but we are much older than any church. We are the preservers of knowledge that was ancient when Moses walked the earth. And we have learned that the best way to preserve such knowledge is to cease to exist, officially speaking. Let the world forget us. Let the chronicles record only what is safe to remember. Meanwhile, we do our work in the spaces between the written words. And so the conspiracy was born. Hugus recruited 8 men he could trust with his life warriors who had proven themselves in battle, who possessed the courage to face the unknown, and who harbored the same hunger for power that burned in his own breast. Godfrey de Saint Omer, a giant of a man whose sword had drunk the blood of 100 enemies. Andre de Montbard, whose mind was as sharp as any blade. Payan de Montdidier, whose loyalty was absolute and unquestioning. And 5 others, each chosen for specific skills and qualities that would prove essential in the years to come. Together, these 9 men knelt in the ruins of Solomon's temple and swore their public oath to protect Christian pilgrims, to live in poverty and chastity, to serve God and the Church with unwavering devotion. The ceremony was witnessed by the Patriarch of Jerusalem and blessed by visiting clergy who saw in these noble warriors the very embodiment of Christian virtue. But what those witnesses didn't see was the 10th figure who stood in the shadows at the edge of the torch light, his lips moving in a different oath entirely, an oath in a language that predated Latin, predated Greek, predated even Hebrew, the sacred tongue of the priests of Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom and magic, an oath that bound him not to any church or kingdom, but to the ancient knowledge itself and to those who would wield it in the ages to come. As the ceremony concluded and the 9 knights rose to accept the congratulations and blessings of the church officials, the guide melted into the darkness like morning mist beneath the desert sun. But his presence would be felt in every decision the Templars made, in every excavation they conducted, in every artifact they recovered from the hidden places where Egyptian magic slept. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ had been born. But so had something else, a secret society within the secret society, a mission that had nothing to do with protecting pilgrims and everything to do with recovering the magical, legacy of a civilization that had fallen 3,000 years before. Christ was born, and at the center of it all stood the man who would become the 13th knight, though he would never be counted among the 12 who officially succeeded the original 9, the man whose name would be systematically erased from every record, the man who knew that true power comes not from being remembered, but from being forgotten while still pulling the strings that move the world. The game had begun. The treasures of Egypt awaited, and 9 brave knights had no idea that they were pawns in a game far older and far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. But one thing was certain. Before this story reached its bloody conclusion, some of them would wish they had never heard of Egyptian magic. never touched the artifacts that promised such power, never taken that oath in the ruins of a temple built on secrets that should have remained buried forever. The desert wind whispered through the stones. That night, carrying with it the scent of ancient tombs and older promises. And if you had been there, if you had possessed the sight to see beyond the physical world, you would have noticed something troubling. The shadows cast by the 10 figures didn't quite match their physical forms. Some were too long, others too dark, and one, the guide's shadow, seemed to move independently of its owner, as if it possessed a will and awareness all its own. The ancient powers were stirring, and they were hungry. The first excavation beneath Solomon's temple began on a night when the moon hid its face behind clouds thick as funeral shrouds. Hugus de Payens stood at the entrance to a shaft that his men had spent 3 weeks digging in secret. The official story being that they were clearing rubble to create better quarters for their order. But the guide had shown him exactly where to dig, had traced maps in the dirt that matched no contemporary knowledge of the temple's foundations, had whispered measurements that came from architectural plans drawn up when the pharaoh Khufu was still drawing breath. You can feel the tension in that moment as Hugus lowered himself into darkness that had been undisturbed for millennia. His torch cast dancing shadows on walls that bore no Christian symbols, no Hebrew inscriptions, nothing that belonged to Solomon's era at all. Instead, the stones were carved with hieroglyphs that seemed to writhe in the flickering light, images of gods with animal heads, of sacred boats carrying the sun through the underworld, of rituals that would make any faithful Christian cross himself in horror. This temple was built on something older, the guide had explained during their planning sessions. Solomon was wise, they say, wise enough to know that certain foundations should not be disturbed, only built upon. The chambers you seek were sealed 1,000 years before his time, placed here by Egyptian priests who fled north when their own land became too dangerous for the knowledge they protected. Now, standing in those chambers for the first time, Hugus understood what the guide had meant. This wasn't a cellar or a storage room. This was a shrine, perfectly preserved by the dry air and the sanctity of the ground above. Along the walls stood statues of gods whose names he didn't know, figures with the heads of falcons and crocodiles, jackals and cats, all carved from stone that seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth, despite having been locked in cold darkness for so long. But it was what rested on the altar at the chamber's center that made Hugus's breath catch in his throat. A wooden chest, its surface covered in gold leaf that still gleamed as if freshly applied, and around it, scattered like offerings to whatever had been placed inside, were objects that made his hands tremble with a mixture of fear and desperate hunger, amulets shaped like scarabs, each carved from a different precious stone, lapis lazuli blue as the desert sky, carnelian red as fresh blood, emerald green as the Nile in flood season, rings inscribed with hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them directly, a ceremonial dagger whose blade was forged from metal that shouldn't exist, not bronze, not iron, but something that reflected torch light in shades of purple and gold that hurt the eyes to behold. And most striking of all, suspended on a golden chain above the altar, an ankh larger than any Hugus had seen in the ruins of this land, the looped cross of Egyptian religion, symbol of eternal life, but this one was different. The loop at the top contained a crystal that captured the torch light and seemed to magnify it, sending beams of illumination dancing across the ceiling like imprisoned stars desperate for freedom. "Don't touch anything yet," the guide's voice came from behind him, making Hugus jump despite himself. The man moved like smoke through shadows, appearing and disappearing without sound or warning. These objects are not mere decorations or grave goods. Each one is a repository of power, a tool crafted by priests who understood forces that your church has convinced itself don't exist. Touch the wrong item in the wrong way, and it will drain the life from you before you can draw a breath to scream. Hugus wanted to ask how the guide knew so much, wanted to demand answers about who this man truly was and what his real interest in these artifacts might be. But another part of him, the part that had led him to take this insane gamble in the first place, didn't care about answers. He only cared about power, about possessing what no other Christian knight had ever touched, about becoming something more than human through the magic of a dead civilization. "Teach me," he said simply. "Show me how to use them safely." The guide's smile in the torchlight was the smile of a serpent who is finally convinced Eve to take the forbidden fruit. "Oh, my ambitious friend, we have so much work to do. But first, you must understand something crucial. These artifacts don't give power freely. They require payment, not gold or prayer or sacrifice in the way your church understands such things. They require belief, true belief. You must believe that the Egyptian gods were real, that their magic functioned, that the forces they controlled still exist and can be commanded by those with knowledge and will." "But that's heresy," Hugus protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "The church teaches that Egyptian gods were false idols, demons at worst, figments of imagination at best. The church," the guide said with infinite contempt, "is barely 1,000 years old. These powers were being wielded when the church's god was nothing but a provincial deity in a small corner of the Roman Empire. The Egyptian civilization lasted 3,000 years. Hugus, 3,000 years. They built monuments that still stand when kingdoms your ancestors served have crumbled to dust. They mummified their dead with such skill that bodies thousands of years old look as if they died yesterday. They moved blocks of stone that would require machines your age cannot build. And they did all of this through understanding forces that your priests dismiss as superstition." He moved to the altar with the confidence of a man in his own home. "This amulet here," he said, pointing to a scarab of deep blue lapis, "grants its wearer the ability to understand any spoken language, not through divine inspiration or miraculous gift, but through activation of certain capacities that exist dormant in every human mind. The Egyptians understood that the brain is not merely an organ, but a gateway to forces beyond the physical. This scarab, when worn against the skin and activated with the proper incantation, opens that gateway just slightly, enough to perceive the intention behind words regardless of the tongue that speaks them." Hugus stared at the amulet with hunger naked on his face. To understand any language, imagine the intelligence advantage that would provide. Imagine being able to negotiate with Saracen merchants, understand the plots of Arabic princes, decipher the documents of enemies who thought their language made their secrets safe. "And this," the guide continued, moving to the ceremonial dagger with the impossible blade, is a weapon that cuts through more than mere flesh. It was forged in rituals that lasted 40 days and nights, blessed by every god in the Egyptian pantheon, quenched in waters drawn from the sacred lake of Karnak. A man cut by this blade doesn't just die Hizga. His life force is absorbed by the weapon itself, making it sharper with each killing, more powerful with each soul consumed. The pharaoh's assassins carried blades like this. One man with this weapon could kill a dozen guards before they even realized death had entered the room. The casual way the guide spoke of murder and soul-stealing should have horrified Hugas, should have sent him running back to the surface to confess his sins and beg forgiveness from God. But instead he felt only excitement, a thrilling sense that he was glimpsing possibilities that existed beyond the narrow confines of Christian morality. The Ankh, the guide said, approaching the final and most impressive artifact, is perhaps the most valuable of all. It is a healing tool, but not in the way your priests think of healing through prayer and faith. This Ankh channels the life force itself, what the Egyptians called Sekhem, the power that animates all living things. A man dying from a sword wound, from poison, from plague, place this Ankh upon his chest, speak the words of activation, and his body will knit itself together in moments. Bones will mend, organs will restore themselves, even lost blood will be replaced by the body drawing upon reserves it didn't know it possessed. Hugas's mind was racing with implications. An order of knights who could heal battle wounds almost instantly. Warriors who would fight with absolute fearlessness, knowing that death from normal weapons had been rendered nearly impossible. The military advantage would be staggering. But, the guide continued, his voice taking on a warning tone, every healing drains the life force from somewhere. The Ankh draws upon the Sekhem of everything living within a certain radius. Plants wither, animals weaken. Even the user himself ages slightly with each healing performed. Use it too often, and you'll find yourself surrounded by dead earth and prematurely aged companions. The Egyptians understood this. They used healing magic sparingly, with full knowledge of the price. Your Christian innocence about cause and effect, your belief that miracles come without cost, that is what will make these tools dangerous in your hands. For the first time, Hugas felt a tremor of doubt. Not enough to make him turn back, he had come too far for that, but enough to understand that the guide was right. These weren't simple magical trinkets from fairy tales. They were sophisticated tools created by a civilization that had spent thousands of years studying forces that his own culture had deliberately forgotten. Over the following weeks, 8 more knights descended into those chambers. Each was shown the artifacts. Each was taught the basics of their use. And each was made to swear a new oath, this one far more binding than the public vows they had taken before the patriarch. This oath was sworn on the Ankh itself, with hands pressed against the crystal in its loop, with words spoken in ancient Egyptian that none of them truly understood, but all of them felt in their bones. They swore secrecy absolute. They swore loyalty to each other above any earthly authority. They swore to protect the knowledge they had gained, even if doing so meant betraying their church, their king, or their God himself. And they swore one final thing, the most important oath of all. They swore to find the rest of the Egyptian artifacts, to excavate every tomb, to explore every temple, to recover every scrap of magical knowledge that remained hidden in the sands of Egypt. Because this chamber, beneath Solomon's temple, the guide explained, was only a beginning. It was a cache left by priests who had fled Egypt during one of its periodic upheavals, a small collection meant to preserve the most essential tools and knowledge. But the real treasures, the truly powerful artifacts, remained in Egypt itself, in tombs that hadn't been opened since the time of the pharaohs, in temples dedicated to gods whose worship had been forbidden even before Rome fell, in hidden workshops where the greatest magical craftsmen of the ancient world had created wonders that would seem like miracles to medieval eyes. The Egyptian civilization fell. The guide told them during one of their secret meetings, not because it grew weak or corrupt, but because it became too powerful. The priests developed abilities that frightened even the pharaohs. They could extend life beyond natural limits. They could manipulate the forces of nature itself, calling rain, preventing floods, even dimming the sun in the sky. And they could open gateways to realms beyond the physical world, places where entities existed that were neither gods nor demons, but something altogether different. He paused, letting that sink in. Other civilizations noticed. Other priesthoods, other magical traditions that existed in lands you've never heard of. They recognized that Egypt was on the verge of a breakthrough that would have made them the unquestionable masters of the known world. So they struck. Not with armies can be defeated. They struck with a curse, a great working of magic that took decades to complete, woven by sorcerers from a dozen different lands, all united in their fear of Egyptian supremacy. What kind of curse? André de Montbard asked, his analytical mind immediately seeking details. A curse of forgetting, the guide replied. Not instantaneous, but gradual. Over several generations, the Egyptians forgot how their own magic worked. Master priests died without being able to pass on their knowledge to students. Ancient texts became unreadable even to those who had studied them for years. The very language of magic began to slip away like water through grasping fingers. Within 2 centuries, the greatest magical civilization in human history had become a shadow of itself, its people still building monuments, but no longer understanding why their ancestors had built them in certain ways, still performing rituals, but no longer grasping their true purpose. The 9 knights sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend the scale of what they were being told. A curse that lasted centuries. A magical attack so subtle that its victims didn't even know they were under assault until it was too late. But the curse had a weakness, the guide continued. It could only affect those of Egyptian blood who remained in Egyptian lands. Priests who fled, who established themselves in distant places like Jerusalem, they retained their knowledge. They couldn't return without succumbing to the forgetting, but they could preserve what they knew for future generations. Generations who would not be Egyptian, who would not be bound by the curse, who could recover the ancient knowledge and use it without restriction. He looked at each knight in turn, his dark eyes glittering with satisfaction. That is what you will become, the new masters of Egyptian magic, warriors who combine the fighting skill of your Frankish tradition with powers that will make you seem like demigods to your enemies. And all you must do is venture into Egypt, find the hidden tombs and temples that I will guide you to, and claim what was meant to be yours all along. It was Godfrey de Saint-Omer who asked the question that should have been obvious from the beginning. "And what do you get out of this, guide? Why are you helping us instead of claiming these powers for yourself?" The guide's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Because I am bound by oaths of my own. Oaths that prevent me from wielding certain powers directly, but do not prevent me from helping others to wield them. Think of me as a scholar who can read the book but not speak the words aloud. I can teach you the incantations, show you the proper rituals, guide you to the artifacts. But the actual use of these powers that must be yours, it was a lie, of course. Not about being bound by oaths, that part was true enough, but about his real motivations. The guide had plans within plans, agendas that would only become clear years later when the consequences of this knight's decisions came crashing down upon the order like God's own judgment. But the 9 knights were too intoxicated by possibility to question further. They had touched magic. They had felt power flowing through artifacts older than Christianity. They had seen visions of themselves as more than mere warriors, transformed into something approaching the heroes of ancient legends. And so they agreed. They would travel to Egypt under the pretense of protecting pilgrims on the roads to and from the Holy Land. They would explore the deserts and the ruins. They would excavate tombs that had been sealed for thousands of years, and they would bring back every artifact, every scroll, every scrap of magical knowledge they could find. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon were about to become the world's most successful tomb raiders, and not one of them realized that they were setting in motion events that would culminate in betrayal and death, and in the formation of a legend that would haunt their order for nearly 1,000 years, the legend of the 13th Knight, the one who was never counted among their number, the one whose name would be systematically erased from every record, the one whose curse would make the number 13 synonymous with doom and misfortune for centuries to come. But that revelation still lay years in the future, for now there was only excitement, anticipation, and the intoxicating scent of ancient magic hanging in the air like incense from a forbidden temple. The desert was waiting, and it was hungry. The first expedition into Egypt proper began in the spring of 1119, when the desert heat was still bearable, and the Nile floods had receded enough to reveal passages that spent half the year under water. 3 knights made this initial journey: Hugues de Payens himself, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, and Payen de Montdidier. They traveled disguised as merchants seeking to establish trade routes, their true purpose known only to themselves and the guide, who had provided them with maps that showed locations no contemporary cartographer would recognize. You need to understand what Egypt was like in those days. The glory of the pharaohs had faded into legend more than a millennium earlier. The great temples stood half buried in sand, their hieroglyphs already mysterious to the Arabic-speaking people who now called this land home. The pyramids loomed over Giza like mountains built by giants, and local superstition held that they were haunted by jinn, who would curse anyone foolish enough to violate their depths. But the 3 knights weren't deterred by superstition. They carried with them the scarab amulet that granted understanding of any language, and through its power they could communicate with the Bedouin guides who knew the desert's secrets. More importantly, they carried detailed instructions from the guide about which tombs to seek, which temples held hidden chambers, and most crucially, which magical protections they would encounter and how to bypass them. The first tomb they opened was that of a priest named Amenhotep, who had served the god Thoth during the reign of Ramesses II. The entrance had been sealed with more than just stone. The guide had warned them about this. Egyptian tomb builders had developed techniques for creating magical barriers that would drive away or kill intruders without the need for physical traps. You'll feel it before you see it, Guide had explained back in Jerusalem. A pressure in your mind growing stronger as you approach the sealed entrance. Most men turn back at this point, convinced by their own instincts that proceeding would mean death. Those who persist find the pressure becoming pain headaches that feel like iron bands tightening around the skull, nausea that drops grown men to their knees, eventually unconsciousness and death if they refuse to retreat. To counter this protection, the knights carried an amulet the guide had given them, a small clay tablet inscribed with hieroglyphs that identified the bearer as a priest of Thoth with legitimate business in the tomb. As Hugas held this tablet and approached the sealed entrance, he felt the promised pressure beginning to build. But instead of increasing to unbearable levels, it remained constant, uncomfortable but manageable, like the attention of a guard who watches you pass, but doesn't challenge your right to be there. Breaking through the physical seal took 3 days of careful work. The stones had been fitted together with such precision that a knife blade couldn't slip between them, and mortar made from compounds that remained as hard as the day they were applied nearly 3,000 years earlier. But eventually the barrier gave way, and stale air rushed out, carrying the scent of natron and myrrh, of linen wrappings and something else, something that smelled like time itself, concentrated and preserved. Inside, the tomb was smaller than the grand monuments of the pharaohs, but what it lacked in size it made up for in the precision of its decoration. Every wall was covered in hieroglyphs and images painted in colors that still glowed despite the centuries. The burial chamber contained a stone sarcophagus, its lid carved with the image of Amenhotep himself, shown in the prime of life with the symbols of his priestly office, held in his crossed arms. But it wasn't the sarcophagus that drew their attention. Along the walls stood wooden chests, their surfaces covered in protective spells written in hieroglyphs that seemed to writhe in their torchlight. The guide's instructions had been specific about which chest to open first, and in what order to examine the contents. The first chest contained papyrus scrolls, their preservation miraculous given their age. Hugas unrolled one carefully, and found himself looking at diagrams that made no sense to his medieval understanding, geometric patterns that seemed to shift depending on how you looked at them, mathematical formulas that used symbols he'd never seen, instructions in hieroglyphic script that the scarab amulet allowed him to understand, but not necessarily to comprehend. "These are instruction manuals," Godfrey said, his voice hushed with wonder. The big knight had proven surprisingly adept at understanding the theoretical aspects of Egyptian magic. "This one I'm holding describes how to create an amulet that protects against fire, not by making the wearer immune to heat, but by creating a field around them that redirects flame away from their body." Payan was examining another scroll with growing excitement. "And this one deals with the creation of weapons. Listen to this. It says that bronze properly treated with certain compounds and blessed during specific astronomical alignments can cut through iron as if it were soft clay. The Egyptians knew this. They deliberately kept their enemies in the Bronze Age, while they themselves had access to superior metallurgy. But the real treasures were in the other chests. Amulets by the dozens, each carefully wrapped in linen and labeled with hieroglyphs describing their function. Some granted enhanced physical abilities, strength beyond natural human limits, speed that allowed a man to strike before his opponent could react, endurance that let warriors march for days without rest. Others provided more subtle advantages, the ability to sense danger before it manifested, enhanced healing that stopped wounds from festering, even protection against poisons that would kill normal men. And then there were the truly extraordinary items. A ring that, when worn and activated, made the wearer's appearance shift slightly. Not enough to change their fundamental features, but enough that witnesses would have difficulty recognizing or describing them later. A pendant that sharpened the mind's ability to remember, allowing the wearer to recall conversations word for word even years after they occurred. An ankh similar to the one they'd found in Jerusalem, but this one specialized in a different aspect of healing. It could cure diseases rather than wounds, driving sickness from the body by realigning the life force that illness had disrupted. The Knights spent 3 days cataloging and carefully packing these artifacts, knowing that each one represented power that could transform their order from a handful of warriors into something far more formidable. But they also found something that gave them pause, a warning, inscribed on the wall of the burial chamber in hieroglyphs that required the scarab amulet to read properly. "Let he who takes these tools understand the price of power," Hugues read aloud, his voice echoing in the confined space. "The gods of Egypt are not dead, merely sleeping. Wake them carelessly, and they will demand payment in blood and souls. These artifacts are not gifts but loans, granted to those who serve the balance between order and chaos, between the living world and the realm of the dead. Use them with wisdom, or become that which you seek to control." Payan laughed nervously. "Merely superstition, meant to frighten grave robbers. We're not robbing, we're recovering knowledge that was meant to be preserved." But Hugues wasn't so sure. There was something about the warning that resonated with him, perhaps because he'd already seen hints of the price the guide had mentioned. The healing ankh that aged those around it, the dagger that consumed souls, even the simple language understanding. Scarab carried a cost wearing it for too long, gave the bearer splitting headaches, and strange dreams filled with voices speaking in tongues that had been dead for millennia. Over the following months, the 3 knights opened a dozen more tombs, each yielding new treasures and new knowledge. They excavated beneath temples dedicated to gods whose worship had been forbidden even before. Ron fell Sobek the crocodile god, Sekhmet the lioness goddess of war, Set the god of storms and chaos. Each temple's hidden vaults contained artifacts specific to that deity's domain. From Sobek's temple they recovered items that granted power over water amulets that allowed a man to breathe underwater, rings that could calm or agitate any body of water within sight, even a staff that, when planted in dry earth and activated with the proper incantation, would cause water to well up from underground sources. From Sekhmet's temple they took weapons of terrible power spears that never missed their target once thrown, shields that could turn aside any blade, no matter how powerfully wielded, and most disturbing of all, a mask that when worn transformed the wearer's fighting ability to supernatural levels. Men who put on that mask reported feeling Sekhmet's presence flooding into them, her rage and bloodlust overwhelming their own consciousness, turning them into perfect killing machines that would slaughter everything in their path until physically restrained by their companions. Set's temple, they recovered artifacts related to storms and chaos, an amulet that could summon wind on a calm day, a rod that called lightning from clear skies, and a small statue that when activated created confusion and disorder in the minds of everyone within a certain radius, making organized resistance impossible as soldiers forgot their orders and allies mistook each other for enemies. But with each tomb they opened, with each temple they violated, Hugas began to notice something troubling. The dreams he'd experienced occasionally, after first using the scarab amulet, were becoming more frequent and more vivid. He wasn't just hearing ancient voices anymore, he was seeing through ancient eyes, experiencing memories that weren't his own dot in one recurring dream. He stood in a great hall filled with priests wearing the regalia of a dozen different gods. They were arguing about something, their voices rising in anger as they debated a decision that would affect their entire civilization. He couldn't make out all the words, but the emotional content was clear. These men were terrified. They had discovered something or created something that had gotten beyond their control, and they were planning to hide it, to seal it away in a location so secret that even their own records would give no hint of where to find it. When Hugas mentioned these dreams to his companions, he discovered they were having similar experiences. Godfrey dreamed of battles fought with weapons that fired beams of light that burned through armor and flesh, like sunlight through fog. Payan dreamed of rituals performed in temples that no longer existed, rituals that opened doorways to realms where beings of pure energy dwelt, waiting to be summoned by those with knowledge and courage to command them, the guide. When they reported these experiences during a supply meeting in Alexandria, seemed pleased rather than concerned. The artifacts are awakening memories within you, he explained. Not your own memories, of course, but the genetic memories carried in your blood. All humans descend ultimately from the same origins, but some bloodlines carry stronger traces of ancient knowledge than others. The Egyptian priests understood this. They bred themselves deliberately to maintain and strengthen these genetic memories, passing down not just knowledge but the actual experience of their ancestors. That's not possible, Hugas protested. Memories are formed by our own experiences, not inherited from our parents. The guide's smile was patient but condescending. Your church teaches many things that are not true. The soul, they say, is separate from the body, immaterial and eternal. The Egyptians knew better. They understood that consciousness arises from physical structure, that memory is encoded in the very substance of our flesh, and that under certain conditions these encoded memories can be accessed by descendants who carry the same physical patterns. He gestured to the artifacts they had recovered, now filling several large chests. Each time you use one of these tools, each time you speak an incantation or perform a ritual, you're not just manipulating external forces. You're activating dormant structures within your own mind and body, structures that have been passed down through countless generations, waiting for the proper stimulus to awaken them. The dreams you're experiencing are not random, they're your ancestors' memories, bubbling up from the depths where they've been preserved. This explanation should have frightened them, should have made them question whether the power they were gaining was worth the price of having their own identities potentially overwritten by ancient personalities, resurfacing from genetic memory. But the three knights were too far gone, too committed to the path they had chosen. The power was intoxicating, and the promise of more power to come was irresistible. By the time they returned to Jerusalem in late 1119, they had recovered enough artifacts and scrolls to fill a small warehouse. The other 6 knights, who had remained behind to maintain the appearance of their order's legitimate activities, were astounded by what they brought back. Here was power enough to make their order the most formidable military force in the Christian world. Here was knowledge that would give them advantages over every enemy they might face. But they had also brought back something else, something they didn't fully understand yet. In their eagerness to claim the treasures of Egypt, they had violated protocols that the ancient priests had established for good reason. They had opened tombs without performing the proper rituals of appeasement. They had taken artifacts without leaving appropriate offerings. They had disturbed balances that had been maintained for thousands of years. And in the realm beyond the physical, in the dimensions where the Egyptian gods were not myths but actual entities of immense power and alien intelligence, something had taken notice. The gods were sleeping. Yes, but sleep is not death. And when you steal from the sleeping, sometimes they wake up angry. The curse that would eventually destroy the Knights Templar and create the legend of the 13th Knight had not yet manifested, but its seeds had been planted in those Egyptian tombs, waiting to germinate in the darkness of secrets and the soil of betrayal that would come later. For now, there was only triumph, excitement, and the giddy sense of having gotten away with the greatest heist in human history. The knights had no idea that they were already marked, that every artifact they carried bore a price that would eventually come due. The gods of Egypt are patient. They have all the time in the world, and they always collect their debts. The transformation of the Knights Templar from a small band of warrior monks into a formidable force began in earnest in 1120, fueled by artifacts that should have remained buried in Egyptian sand. But success, as you'll discover, breeds attention, and not all attention is welcome. When you're harboring secrets that could see you burned as a heretic, Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, was the first to notice that something unusual was happening with the knights who had taken up residence in the ruins of Solomon's Temple. These men who had sworn vows of poverty somehow seemed to have access to resources that didn't match their official income. They moved with a confidence that suggested they possessed advantages beyond normal military training. And most puzzling of all, they survived encounters that should have killed them. The incident that brought this to the king's attention occurred during a skirmish with Saracen raiders near Jericho. A Templar patrol of just 5 knights encountered a force of nearly 30 mounted warriors. By all reasonable calculation, the Templars should have retreated or been slaughtered. Instead, they charged directly into the enemy formation and emerged victorious with only minor wounds, leaving behind dead and dying raiders who babbled in terror about knights who moved too fast to see clearly, whose blades cut through armor as if it were cloth, who seemed to know where attacks were coming from before the blows were struck, You can imagine the king's confusion when survivors of the Saracen force were questioned. They spoke of sorcery, of warriors who fought with the blessing of jinn, of weapons that glowed with unholy light in the heat of battle. Baldwin was a practical man, a veteran of countless fights himself, and he knew the difference between frightened exaggeration and genuine terror. These men had seen something that defied their understanding of how combat worked. So he summoned Hugues de Payens to court and asked directly what advantages his knights possessed that allowed 5 men to defeat 30. Hugues had prepared for this moment. The guide had coached him extensively on how to deflect such questions without lying. Outright lies could be detected by skilled interrogators, but careful truth-telling that revealed nothing important was an art form in itself. "Your Majesty," Hugues said with a humility that masked his racing thoughts, "we have discovered certain techniques in our studies of the ancient world, methods of training and discipline that allow a warrior to push beyond normal human limits. The Romans knew such techniques, the Spartans before them. We have merely recovered knowledge that was lost when their civilizations fell. It was true enough the artifacts did allow warriors to push beyond normal limits." Hugues simply neglected to mention that these techniques involved Egyptian magic rather than training regimens. Baldwin wasn't entirely satisfied with this answer, but he also wasn't foolish enough to look too closely at a gift. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was constantly under pressure from Muslim forces that outnumbered Christian defenders. If his Knights Templar had somehow discovered methods that made them more effective fighters, he would be a fool to discourage such developments by asking uncomfortable questions. "Very well," the king said finally. "Continue your studies, continue your training, and continue protecting the pilgrims and defending this holy kingdom. But Hugues, if your methods stray into practices that the church would find troubling, you will find that my protection has limits." It was a warning, carefully worded but unmistakable. Baldwin suspected that something unorthodox was happening, but as long as the Templars remained useful and didn't flaunt whatever advantage they possessed, he would allow them to continue. The balance was delicate, and both men knew it, but if the king's attention was manageable, the attention they were receiving from another quarter was far more dangerous. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, Warmond of Piquedney, was a devout man who took his spiritual responsibilities seriously, and he had begun to notice troubling signs among the Templars under his ecclesiastical authority. Several of the knights had been observed speaking in their sleep, using words that sounded like no language the monks who overheard them could identify. Others displayed knowledge of subjects they should have had no opportunity to study. Brother Godfrey, discussing mathematical concepts that wouldn't be taught in European universities for centuries. Brother André describing astronomical observations that contradicted accepted church teaching about the heavens. Most disturbing of all were reports that some of the knights wore amulets and carried objects that bore symbols associated with pagan Egypt. When questioned about these items, the knights claimed they were merely curiosities recovered from ancient ruins, souvenirs of their time in the Holy Land. But the Patriarch knew that the Church took a very dim view of such curiosities. Too many Christians had been led astray by the allure of pagan artifacts that opened doors to demonic influence. The Patriarch's investigation began quietly, as these things always did, Monks were instructed to observe the Templars more carefully during their prayers and devotions. Servants were questioned about any unusual activities they might have witnessed. Fellow knights from other orders were encouraged to report anything strange about Templar behavior or capabilities, and slowly a picture began to emerge that deeply troubled Warman. These men who had sworn to serve Christ seemed to be involved in practices that bore uncomfortable similarities to accounts of Egyptian sorcery from the writings of the Church Fathers. They possessed objects that radiated an aura of wrongness to those sensitive to such things. They spoke incantations that were definitely not Latin prayers, and they displayed abilities that suggested they had formed pacts with powers that no Christian should traffic with. The guide, when informed of these developments through his network of informants, recognized the danger immediately. The Church will tolerate much in the service of defending the Holy Land, he told the 9 knights during an emergency meeting in the underground chambers. But it will not tolerate magic, especially magic derived from pagan sources. If the Patriarch decides to formally investigate you, if he brings charges of heresy, even King Baldwin won't be able to protect you. You'll be arrested, your possessions will be seized, and everything you've worked for will be destroyed. The knights sat in stunned silence, the weight of their situation suddenly pressing down upon them. They had been so focused on acquiring power, on learning to use the artifacts they'd recovered, that they hadn't fully considered the consequences of being discovered. Now those consequences loomed like an executioner's blade. "What do we do?" Payan asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Destroy the artifacts? Return them to the tombs?" "Absolutely not," the guide said sharply. "The artifacts are too valuable to abandon, and besides, getting rid of them now would be seen as an admission of guilt. No, we need a different approach. We need to make the Church believe that your power comes from a source they cannot question." He let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "You need to find something that legitimizes your activities in the eyes of the Church. Something so holy, so important to Christian doctrine, that possessing it would make you heroes rather than heretics. Something that would make even the most suspicious churchman hesitate to move against you." Hugues understood immediately. "You're talking about relics, Christian relics." The guide nodded. "Specifically, you need to discover relics here in Jerusalem. This city has been conquered and reconquered so many times that countless holy objects have been lost over the centuries. If the Knights Templar were to excavate beneath the Temple Mount and find, say, fragments of the true cross, or perhaps the lance that pierced Christ's side, or even objects associated with Solomon himself, well, suddenly your digging activities would be seen as divinely inspired rather than suspiciously focused on pre-Christian remains. It was brilliant in its cynicism. Create a Christian cover story for their Egyptian excavations. Claim that God had guided them to recover lost relics, when in reality they were looting tombs for magical artifacts. Mix enough genuine Christian relics or convincing forgeries in with the Egyptian materials, and anyone investigating would see what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. Over the following months, the Templars orchestrated a series of carefully staged discoveries. A wooden cup claimed to have been used at the Last Supper, conveniently found in a chamber beneath the Temple Mount. Iron nails, said to be from the crucifixion, discovered among rubble that the knights had been clearing. A scroll purportedly written by King Solomon himself. detailing the construction of the temple and the treasures it had once contained. Some of these relics were genuine Christian artifacts that had indeed been lost over the centuries. Jerusalem had been looted so many times that valuable objects had been hidden and then forgotten in countless locations. Others were forgeries, created with enough age and authenticity to fool medieval experts who had no concept of carbon dating or materials analysis. And a few were Egyptian artifacts that had been creatively reinterpreted, and Ankh became a representation of the Christian cross. A papyrus scroll with hieroglyphs was claimed to be encoded biblical text. A statue with vaguely humanoid features was declared to be an ancient representation of a Christian saint. The strategy worked brilliantly. When the Patriarch heard that the Templars had recovered fragments of the true cross and other holy relics, his suspicions were overwhelmed by excitement. These men weren't trafficking with pagan magic. They were recovering the lost treasures of Christendom. Their unusual abilities weren't derived from Egyptian sorcery, but from the blessing of God, who had chosen them as instruments to restore holy objects to the Church. A formal ceremony was held in which the Templars presented their discoveries to the Patriarch and King Baldwin. Hugues gave a carefully rehearsed speech about how their excavations beneath the Temple Mount had been guided by divine inspiration, how they had prayed for guidance and been led to chambers that contained both Christian relics and ancient texts that shed new light on biblical history. The Patriarch wept with joy as he held what he believed to be nails from the crucifixion. The king marveled at the scroll attributed to Solomon, seeing it as confirmation that the temple had indeed been as glorious as Scripture described. And throughout the ceremony, the 9 knights maintained expressions of humble piety while concealing the Egyptian amulets they wore beneath their habits. The artifacts that allowed them to project false emotions that even trained observers couldn't detect as deception. But there was someone in attendance that day who was not fooled. A visiting cleric from Rome, a thin man with eyes that seemed to see too much, watched the proceedings with an expression that suggested profound skepticism. His name was Cardinal Matthias, and he specialized in investigating reports of heresy and supernatural phenomena. He had been sent to Jerusalem specifically because rumors of the Templars' unusual activities had reached the Vatican, and Rome wanted to know if these rumors had substance. Cardinal Matthias said nothing during the ceremony. He smiled and nodded in all the appropriate places, offering congratulations to the Templars for their remarkable discoveries. But Hugues, wearing an amulet that heightened his perception of others' true intentions, could sense the cardinal's suspicion like a physical presence in the room. This man didn't believe the cover story. This man suspected exactly what the Templars were trying to hide. After the ceremony, as the knights celebrated their apparent success in deflecting church investigation, Hugues pulled the guide aside and shared his concerns about the cardinal. The guide's expression grew grave. "Cardinal Matthias," he said slowly, "is more dangerous than you realize. He's not just a church investigator, he's a member of a secret order within the church, dedicated to rooting out exactly the kind of knowledge you've been recovering. They call themselves the Guardians of Orthodoxy, and they've been hunting people like me for centuries." "People like you?" Hugues repeated. "What exactly are you?" For the first time since they'd met, the guide showed something approaching genuine emotion, a flicker of old pain crossing his features. "I am what remains of the Egyptian priesthood," he said quietly. "Not Egyptian by blood, perhaps, but Egyptian by training and knowledge. There have always been those who preserved the ancient wisdom, passing it down through secret lineages even after Egypt fell. We've hidden within other cultures, other religions, waiting for the time when humanity would be ready to reclaim what was lost. I saw in you and your knights an opportunity, Christian warriors who could recover and protect the artifacts without drawing the kind of attention that people like me would attract." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But the Church has its own magical tradition, its own practitioners of the hidden arts, though they would never admit it publicly. The guardians of orthodoxy use the very powers they claim to oppose, employing methods that would shock ordinary believers if they knew. Cardinal Matthias can sense Egyptian magic the way a bloodhound scents its prey. He knows what you're carrying, Hugas. He knows what you've become, and he will destroy you if given the chance." The celebration that had filled the Templar compound just hours earlier evaporated like morning mist. The knights had thought they were safe, that their clever misdirection had satisfied the Church's suspicions. Instead, they had attracted the attention of an enemy far more dangerous than a curious patriarch or a concerned king. "What do we do?" Hugas asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "You run," the guide said simply. "You take the most valuable artifacts and you scatter. Some of you stay here to maintain appearances, but the rest disappear into Europe, establishing commanderies in places where the Church's reach is limited. You hide the knowledge you've gained, distribute it among multiple locations so that no single raid can destroy everything you've built. And you prepare for the long war that's coming." "War?" André de Montbard spoke up, his tactical mind already working through implications. "You mean the Church will move against us openly?" "Not immediately," the guide replied. "The guardians of orthodoxy prefer to work in shadow, just as we do. But they're patient, and they're thorough. They'll spend years investigating you, building a case, positioning their assets. And when they finally strike, it will be with the full authority of the Church behind them. Your order will be condemned as heretics, your knights arrested and tried, your wealth seized, your secrets exposed." He looked at each of them in turn. "Unless you're very, very careful, unless you hide the truth so well that even torture cannot extract it, unless you're willing to sacrifice some of your number to protect the greater whole." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop as the full implications of what the guide was saying became clear. He wasn't just talking about hiding artifacts or maintaining cover stories. He was talking about a permanent conspiracy, a shadow organization within the official Knights Templar, with some members knowing the truth while others remained ignorant, some possessing the artifacts while others served as unwitting shields against investigation. And he was talking about betrayal, about choosing who would be sacrificed when the inevitable persecution came, about deciding which knights would be fed to the Church's inquisitors, while the real treasures and the real knowledge escaped to safety. The 9 knights looked at each other in the dim torchlight, seeing the same dawning horror in each other's eyes. They had thought they were becoming powerful. They had believed they were gaining control over forces that would make them unstoppable. Instead, they had walked into a trap far more subtle and far more complete than any they could have imagined. They had become exactly what the guide needed them to be: visible targets that would draw the churches. attention while the real preservation of Egyptian knowledge proceeded in shadows so deep that even the Templars themselves didn't know where all the pieces were hidden. The legend of the 13th Knight was about to be born, but not in the way any of them expected. The fracture within the Knights Templar began not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a whisper in the darkness of the underground chambers. It was late 1121, nearly 3 years after the first Egyptian artifacts had been recovered, and the 9 founding knights had grown into something far beyond what they had been. They possessed powers that made them formidable in battle, knowledge that gave them advantages in politics and finance, and secrets that bound them together more tightly than any oath sworn before God. But secrets have weight, and over time that weight can crush even the strongest bonds of brotherhood. You need to understand that not all 9 knights had embraced their transformation with equal enthusiasm. While some like Hewis and Godfrey had thrown themselves wholeheartedly into the study and use of Egyptian magic, others had grown increasingly troubled by the path they had chosen. The artifacts granted power, yes, but they also demanded something in return, not just the physical prices the guide had warned about, but something more subtle and more corrosive, a gradual erosion of the faith that had originally brought them to the Holy Land. Brother Russell, one of the quieter members of the founding 9, was the first to voice his doubts openly. During a meeting in the hidden chambers, surrounded by artifacts that pulsed with energies that predated Christianity by millennia, he spoke words that would change everything. "We have become exactly what we swore to oppose," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We took vows to serve Christ, to protect pilgrims, to uphold the faith. Instead, we traffic with pagan powers. We use magic that the Church would rightly condemn as demonic, and we lie to everyone, our brothers in arms, our king, our patriarch. How is this different from the Saracens we fight against, who justify their actions by claiming service to their own false god?" The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. The other knights exchanged glances, some sympathetic to Russell's concerns, others angry at what they saw as weakness or betrayal. It was Hugis who finally responded, and his words carried an edge that suggested he had been expecting this conversation and had prepared his arguments carefully. "We do what is necessary," he said. "The Saracens outnumber us 10 to 1. Without the advantages these artifacts provide, the kingdom of Jerusalem would fall within a year. Every Christian in the Holy Land would be killed or enslaved. Is that what you want, Brother Russell? Would you prefer to maintain your moral purity while children are slaughtered and churches are burned?" "Don't twist my words," Russell shot back. "I'm not saying we should abandon our duties. I'm saying we should abandon these cursed objects and fight as God intended, with faith, with courage, with steel. If we are meant to hold this land, then God will grant us victory. If we are not, then no amount of Egyptian sorcery will change his will." It was the guide who interjected before the argument could escalate further. He had been standing in the shadows as usual, his presence easily forgotten until he chose to make himself known. "You speak of God's will as if it were a simple thing to discern," he said, his voice carrying that strange quality that made even the most confident men doubt themselves. "Tell me, Brother Russell, when the Egyptians ruled their empire for 3,000 years, was that not also a demonstration of divine favor? When they built monuments that still stand while kingdoms of your own era crumble to dust, was that not evidence that their gods, or perhaps the same God wearing a different mask, smiled upon them? That's heresy, Russell said flatly. There is one God, the God of Abraham and Christ. The Egyptian gods were demons or delusions, nothing more. The guide's smile was cold. And yet their delusions grant power that your one God seems reluctant to provide. These artifacts work, Brother Russell. They heal wounds, protect their bearers, grant abilities that save Christian lives every day. If your God disapproves, why does he not strike us down? Why does he not turn the artifacts to dust or render them powerless? Perhaps because he understands something that you, in your limited human wisdom, cannot grasp. That power is power, regardless of its source. And those who refuse to use the tools available to them are fools who deserve their defeat. The theological implications of this argument were staggering. The guide was suggesting that God either approved of their use of Egyptian magic or was indifferent to it, or worse, that the distinction between Christian and pagan powers was meaningless, that there was only one underlying force that different cultures had accessed through different methods. It was a perspective that would get a man burned at the stake in any Christian land. And yet it carried a seductive logic that even Russell found difficult to refute entirely. But Russell wasn't alone in his doubts. Over the following weeks it became clear that the founding nine were splitting into factions. On one side stood those who had fully embraced the power of the artifacts and saw no conflict between their Christian faith and their use of Egyptian magic. They argued that God worked through many instruments. That knowledge was knowledge regardless of its source, and that their success in defending the Holy Land was proof that their methods had divine approval. On the other side were those who believed they had strayed from their original mission, that the artifacts were corrupting their souls even as they enhanced their capabilities, and that they needed to return to pure Christian practice before it was too late. They pointed to the dreams that plagued them, the voices that whispered in ancient languages, the gradual sense that they were becoming something other than the men they had been, and caught between these two factions was a third, group knights who saw the value in the artifacts but also recognized the spiritual danger they represented, who wanted to find some middle path that would allow them to retain their power while also maintaining their Christian identity. This group, led by André de Montbard, proposed a compromise that would ultimately prove impossible to maintain. "We establish strict protocols," André argued during a heated meeting. "We use the artifacts only in direct defense of the faith, never for personal gain or worldly ambition. We confess our use of them to a trusted priest who can provide spiritual guidance and absolution. We dedicate a portion of every day to prayer and penance, asking God's forgiveness for the methods we employ while also asking His understanding of why we employ them. In this way we can serve both our Christian duty and the practical necessity of survival." It was a reasonable proposal, the kind of compromise that in other circumstances might have held a divided group together. But there was a problem that André and the others hadn't fully grasped. The guide had no intention of allowing such a compromise. A Knights Templar that used Egyptian magic only sparingly, that sought priestly oversight, that remained fundamentally Christian in their identity, was not useful for his purposes. He needed them committed, corrupted, so dependent on the artifacts that turning back would be unthinkable, and so he began to manipulate events to force the crisis that would destroy any possibility of middle ground. The opportunity came in the form of Cardinal Matthias, the Vatican investigator who had never fully accepted the Templars' cover story about discovering Christian relics. He had remained in Jerusalem for months after the ceremony, ostensibly to study the recovered artifacts, but actually to investigate the knights themselves. His servants reported back with disturbing observations knights who spoke in their sleep using words that sounded Egyptian, not Latin, objects that glowed with their own light when carried in darkness, rituals performed in the underground chambers that bore no resemblance to any Christian ceremony. The guide learned of Matthias's investigation through his network of informants, and rather than warn the knights to be more careful, he did the opposite. He arranged for the cardinal to accidentally discover evidence that would confirm his worst suspicions. A servant in Matthias's household, one who had been carefully cultivated by the guide's agents, found a papyrus scroll that had supposedly been dropped by one of the Templars. The scroll contained hieroglyphic text, along with Latin translations describing rituals for summoning Egyptian gods and binding their power into physical objects. It was exactly the kind of evidence that would prove the Templars were practicing pagan magic, and it had been deliberately planted where the cardinal would find it. When Matthias confronted Hugis with this evidence, demanding an explanation, Hugis found himself in an impossible position. He could deny knowledge of the scroll, but Matthias would simply intensify his investigation. He could claim it was a historical document being studied for scholarly purposes, but the Latin translations made clear that these weren't just ancient texts. They were active instructions for rituals that someone was performing. Or he could tell the truth and face charges of heresy that would destroy not just himself, but his entire order. It was a guide who provided the solution, though it was a solution that would require a sacrifice that none of the knights had anticipated. "Give him a heretic," the guide said during an emergency meeting. "One of your own. Someone who can confess to practicing forbidden magic, can provide enough details to satisfy Matthias's investigation, but who doesn't know enough about the full scope of your activities to truly compromise everything you've built." The implication was clear and horrifying. They would need to offer up one of their own brothers to the Inquisition, knowing that confession under torture would likely be followed by execution. They would need to choose who would die to protect the secrets of the rest. "I'll do it," Russell said quietly. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. "I've been arguing that we should abandon these cursed objects. Let me prove my sincerity. I'll confess to Matthias that I was experimenting with Egyptian magic on my own, without the knowledge or approval of the order. I'll provide enough detail to satisfy his investigation while steering him away from the truth about the artifacts we've hidden, and I'll accept whatever punishment the Church deems appropriate." "They'll torture you," Godfrey said, his voice rough with emotion. "They'll make you suffer before they kill you." "I know," Russell replied, "but perhaps that's what I deserve. Perhaps we all deserve it, for what we've become. At least my death will mean something. It will buy time for the rest of you to hide the artifacts more carefully, to establish better protocols, to maybe find a way back to the path we abandoned." What none of them knew, what Russell himself didn't know, was that the guide had already arranged for certain drugs to be administered to Russell before his interrogation, substances derived from Egyptian alchemical knowledge that would make him more susceptible to suggestion, that would allow his interrogators to implant false memories that seemed absolutely real to Russell himself. He would confess to crimes he hadn't committed, provide details of rituals he'd never performed, all while believing with complete sincerity that he was telling the truth. The confession that Russell gave Cardinal Matthias was everything the investigator could have hoped for. A Templar Knight admitting to practicing Egyptian magic, to summoning demonic powers disguised as ancient gods, to using forbidden artifacts to gain advantages in battle. Russell described in detail rituals he had performed alone in the desert, objects he had recovered from tombs without his brother's knowledge, and the gradual corruption of his faith as the power of the magic seduced him away from Christian orthodoxy. Under torture, and medieval torture was an art form of calculated suffering. Russell elaborated on his confession. He named the Egyptian gods he had invoked: Thoth, Anubis, Set. He described the sensations of power flowing through his body when rituals succeeded. He even provided enough genuine details about the artifact's capabilities that Matthias could verify the truth of at least some of his testimony. But crucially, Russell maintained that he had acted alone. His brother knights, he insisted through pain that would have broken most men, knew nothing of his heretical practices. Payans had tried to guide him back to the path of righteousness when he suspected something was wrong. The other founding knights had prayed for his soul when they noticed his increasingly erratic behavior. The order itself remained pure, dedicated to Christian service, led by faithful men who had stumbled upon Christian relics but never dabbled in pagan magic. Cardinal Matthias wanted to believe that the corruption went deeper. His instincts screamed that Russell was protecting others, that the entire Templar order was tainted with Egyptian sorcery. But without evidence beyond one man's confession, without other witnesses or physical proof that other knights were involved, he couldn't justify moving against the entire order. The political consequences would be too severe. King Baldwin depended on the Templars for Jerusalem's defense, and Rome needed the kingdom to survive. So Matthias accepted Russell's confession and prepared to make an example that would warn any other knights who might be tempted down similar paths. Brother Russell would be publicly tried, convicted of heresy, and burned at the stake as a warning to all who might traffic with demonic powers. The execution took place on a gray morning when winter winds carried the scent of rain from the Mediterranean. Russell was led to the stake in chains, his body bearing the marks of weeks of torture, but his face showing a strange kind of peace. He had been given drugs that made the pain bearable, the guide's final gift, delivered through corrupted guards who believed they were showing mercy to a condemned man. As the flames rose around him, Russell spoke his final words. Not a confession of further sins, not a plea for mercy, but a warning that would haunt the Knights Templar for generations to come. The power we sought has a price, he called out, his voice carrying across the crowd, despite the crackling of burning wood. Not just in this world, but in the world beyond. The Egyptian gods are not dead, only sleeping, and they demand payment for every gift they give. My brothers who survive me know that the debt will come due. The 13th among you The one who walks in shadows, he knows the truth. He has always known. And when the reckoning comes, he will not be there to face it with you." The crowd murmured in confusion at these cryptic words. The 13th among you? The official Knights Templar had 9 founders, later expanded to 12. There was no 13th. Clearly the condemned man was raving, his mind broken by torture and fear. Watching from the crowd with his face carefully composed and an expression of grief and horror, understood exactly what Russell meant. In his final moments, perhaps breaking free of the drugs that had controlled his confession, Russell had tried to warn them about the guide, about the 10th man who stood outside their official number, who had manipulated them into this path, who had sacrificed Russell as casually as one might sacrifice a pawn in a game of chess. Hughes realized with horrible clarity that Russell's execution wasn't the end of the guide's plan. It was the beginning. The guide had demonstrated that he could make the knights betray each other, could force them to choose their survival over their brotherhood, could turn them into exactly the kind of organization that would later earn the Templars their dark reputation. They had thought they were using the guide to access Egyptian power. Instead, the guide had been using them for purposes they still didn't understand. And Russell's warning that the debt would come due, that the 13th among them would not be there to face the reckoning, suggested that an even more terrible betrayal lay ahead. As Russell's screams faded and the flames consumed what remained of their brother, the surviving knights stood in the crowd and felt the first real terror of what they had become. They possessed power, yes, but they had lost something far more valuable, the certainty that they controlled their own destiny. The 13th Knight, the one who was never counted, who existed in the shadows between official history and hidden truth, had just demonstrated how completely he owned them. And the worst part was knowing that they were too deep now, too committed, to turn back even if they wanted to. The curse that would one day destroy the Knights Templar had just claimed its first victim, but it would not be the last. The years following Russell's execution were marked by an expansion that seemed miraculous to outside observers. The Knights Templar grew from 9 founding members to dozens, then hundreds of knights spread across the Holy Land and Europe. They established commanderies in France, England, Spain, and beyond. They developed a banking system that allowed pilgrims to deposit funds in one country and withdraw them in another. They became advisors to kings and confidants of popes. And through it all, they maintained the facade of humble warrior monks dedicated to Christian service. But beneath this public success, the organization was fracturing in ways that only the inner circle could see. The artifacts from Egypt had been distributed among trusted members, hidden in commanderies across Christendom where they could be accessed when needed, but never concentrated in one place that could be raided and destroyed. This distribution was both a security measure and a necessity. The guide had insisted that no single location should hold too many artifacts, lest the concentration of power attract unwanted attention from forces beyond the merely human. You need to understand what he meant by that. The Egyptian artifacts weren't just tools that had been created and then left dormant. They were, in a very real sense, alive. Not with biological life, but with something the Egyptians had called Heka, a fundamental force that animated magic itself. Every time an artifact was used, every time an incantation was spoken, Every time power flowed through these ancient objects, it created ripples in dimensions that existed parallel to the physical world and something was paying attention to those ripples. The first sign came in 1125, 4 years after Rossel's death. A Templar commandery in southern France reported disturbing phenomena. Knights stationed there complained of nightmares that felt more real than waking life. Visions of vast halls lined with statues that moved when you weren't looking directly at them. Of rituals performed by priests whose faces shifted between human and animal features. Of voices chanting in languages that hurt the mind to hear. Some woke with hieroglyphs carved into their flesh. Symbols that hadn't been there when they went to sleep. Marks that burned with fever heat but showed no signs of infection. Hugues, now officially recognized as the first Grand Master of the Order, traveled to investigate personally. What he found shook him to his core. The commandery had been using one of the more powerful artifacts recovered from Egypt, a staff that, when wielded properly, could summon storms and call lightning from clear skies. The knight who had been assigned to study and use this staff, Brother Guillaume, had become something that barely resembled human anymore. Guillaume's eyes had changed. The pupils elongated into vertical slits like those of a serpent. His skin had taken on a faint golden sheen, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that no human throat should produce. He claimed that the God Set had spoken to him, had offered him power beyond anything the artifacts alone could provide, had promised to make him a living vessel for divine might, if he would only open himself fully to the ancient Egyptian powers. The gods are not dead, Grand Master, Guillaume said, and his smile revealed teeth that had sharpened into points. They merely sleep, as your friend Rossel tried to warn you before you burned him. But they dream, and in their dreams they sense when mortals use the tools of their priesthood. They've been watching us, studying us, learning what we are and what we want. And now they're ready to make us an offer. Hugues felt ice water flooding his veins. What kind of offer? Partnership, Guillaume replied. We continue to use the artifacts, continue to grow in power and influence, but we do so with the explicit blessing and guidance of the Egyptian gods themselves. No more fumbling in the dark, trying to decipher ancient instructions. No more wondering if we're using the tools correctly. They will teach us directly, as they once taught their own priests. We will become what the Egyptians were at their height, masters of forces that reshape reality itself. And in exchange? Hugues demanded. What do they want from us? Guillaume's smile widened. Worship, recognition, blood and souls offered in their names. A new priesthood to replace the one that was lost when their civilization fell. And eventually, when we're strong enough, when we've spread across enough of the world, they want temples. Real temples, not the crumbling ruins that dot Egypt now. They want to be worshipped again, to have their power acknowledged, to resume their place as the true gods of humanity. It was exactly what Hugues had feared from the beginning. The artifacts had never been neutral tools waiting passively to be used. They had been bait, carefully designed to attract ambitious mortals and draw them into service to powers that had been waiting in the shadows for thousands of years for someone foolish enough to wake them. No, Hugues said flatly. Destroy the staff. Seal this commandery. Guillaume, you will be confined and exorcised. If that fails, you will be killed. We will not become servants of pagan gods, no matter what power they offer." Guillaume's laughter was terrible to hear, not the sound of madness, but something worse. The sound of someone who knew a secret that would destroy you and was looking forward to revealing it. "You think you can refuse? Grand Master, you've already accepted. Every time you used an artifact, every time you spoke an incantation, every time you drew upon Egyptian magic, you were acknowledging their power, reinforcing their existence, feeding them with the belief and intention that gives gods their strength. You made yourself theirs years ago. The only question now is whether you accept the partnership willingly or have it forced upon you." What happened next was recorded in the secret archives that only Grand Masters were permitted to read. Guillaume was restrained by knights wearing amulets that supposedly protected against hostile magic. But as they tried to remove the staff from his possession, he demonstrated abilities that no artifact should have granted. He moved with speed that blurred the eye, struck with strength that shattered bones, and when finally cornered, he called down lightning that killed 3 knights instantly and set the commandery's chapel ablaze. It took a dozen knights to bring him down. And even then, only because Hugues used one of the most dangerous artifacts in their possession, a dagger that didn't kill the body, but severed the soul from its physical vessel. Guillaume's body collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, while something invisible and screaming fled into the night sky. The knights who witnessed it would never forget the sound rage and despair mixed with a promise of revenge that echoed in a voice like thunder. The incident forced Hugues to confront a truth he had been avoiding. The guide had known this would happen, had known that using Egyptian artifacts would eventually attract the attention of the gods they were connected to, had probably intended it all along, because the guide served those very gods, or at least served the agenda of seeing them return to active worship in the world. When Hugues confronted the guide about this, tracking him down in a location that the mysterious figure had claimed would remain secret, which told Hugues something about how thoroughly the guide's control was slipping. The conversation became heated in a way that previous discussions never had. "You knew," Hugues said, his hand on his sword hilt, though he doubted normal steel would be effective against whatever the guide truly was. "You knew that using these artifacts would wake the Egyptian gods. That was the plan all along, wasn't it? Use us to restore their worship. Make us the new priesthood whether we agreed or not." The guide didn't deny it. "I knew it was a possibility, yes. The gods exist in a state that your Christian theology has no words for, not fully alive in the way you understand life, but not truly dead either. They are sustained by belief, by worship, by the resonance of rituals performed in their names. When those things fade, they fade. When those things return, they return. Your use of the artifacts has been a beacon calling out to them, yes. But that doesn't mean you've lost control of the situation." Guillaume would disagree. Hugues shot back. "He's dead because he couldn't resist what the gods offered him." Guillaume was weak, the guide said dismissively. He wanted power for its own sake, wanted to be special, wanted to transcend his human limitations. Of course the gods found him easy prey. But you're different, Hugues. You wanted power for a purpose to protect the Holy Land. to make your order strong enough to survive the challenges you knew were coming. That clarity of purpose is what will allow you to use the artifacts without being consumed by what you're using. And if I'm wrong? If my purpose isn't enough to protect me? The guide's expression was unreadable. Then you'll end up like Guillaume, or worse. But that's the gamble you took when you first touched those artifacts in Jerusalem, when you first spoke those ancient words, when you first felt power flowing through your body that no human was meant to possess. You knew there would be a price. You simply didn't know how high that price would be. Hugues wanted to kill him, wanted to draw his blade and end this mysterious figure who had manipulated them all into serving agendas they didn't understand. But even as the impulse formed, he felt something stopping him, not fear, but certainty. The guide could not be killed, not by normal means, possibly not by any means available to the Templars. He was protected by the very gods he served, or perhaps was something more than human himself, something that had been old when Egypt was young. The compromise that emerged from this confrontation was unsatisfying to everyone involved. The Templars would continue to use the artifacts because they had become dependent on them for the military and financial success that sustained their order. But they would establish strict protocols about who could use which artifacts, how often they could be used, and what signs to watch for that indicated someone was being corrupted by contact with the Egyptian gods. More importantly, they would begin searching for ways to neutralize or seal the gods themselves. If the artifacts were calling out to sleeping deities, then the solution was to make sure those deities stayed asleep permanently. The guide claimed this was impossible, that you couldn't destroy gods, only diminish them temporarily, but Hugues was determined to try. This led to an expedition that would become legendary within the inner circles of Templar history. A group of knights, including Hugues himself and the now-aged Godfrey de Saint-Omer, traveled deep into Egypt's western desert to a location the guide had reluctantly revealed under pressure. There, hidden beneath sands that had buried it for millennia, they found something that the guide had insisted they would never discover, a tomb unlike any they had seen before. Not the resting place of a pharaoh or a priest, but a prison, a massive structure carved from solid bedrock, its walls covered in hieroglyphs that weren't instructions or prayers but warnings. Seals upon seals, each one designed to contain something that the ancient Egyptians had deemed too dangerous to destroy, but too powerful to leave free. This is where they imprisoned Set. Godfrey breathed as he read the hieroglyphs with the aid of an amulet. Not the god himself, gods can't be truly imprisoned, but a fragment of his consciousness, a piece of his essence that was too corrupted, too chaotic even by the standards of Egyptian theology. They sealed it here and then worked to erase all records of this location, because they knew that if anyone ever found it and broke the seals, Set would use that fragment as a gateway to return to full power in the physical world. Hugues stared at the seals, each one a masterwork of magical engineering. Can we strengthen them? Add our own protections to ensure they're never broken? We could try, Godfrey replied. But Hugues, if this place exists, if the Egyptians really did imprison pieces of their gods, then there must be other prisons, other fragments. And if the gods are waking up, if they're reaching out to people like Guillaume, then they're going to be looking for these prisons trying to free their imprisoned aspects. We can't guard them all. We probably don't even know where they all are. It was a devastating realization. They had thought they were in control, that they were using Egyptian magic for their own purposes. Instead, they had stumbled into the middle of a conflict that had been ongoing for thousands of years. War between different factions of the ancient Egyptian priesthood, between gods who wanted different things for humanity, between forces that operated on time scales that made human lifetimes look like eye blinks. And somewhere in all of this was the guide, playing his own game for his own purposes, moving pieces on a board that the Templars were only beginning to understand existed. As Hughes stood before that ancient prison, feeling the weight of everything they had done and everything it had led to, he made a decision that would define the Templars for the rest of their existence. They would not try to seal the gods away or strengthen ancient prisons. They would do something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. They would become the 13th god themselves, a new power built not from ancient worship but from Christian faith combined with Egyptian magic, a hybrid entity that could stand against the old gods on equal footing. And if that required sacrifices, if it required transforming themselves into something that was neither fully Christian nor fully pagan, then that was a price Hughes was willing to pay. The guide, when he learned of this plan, smiled for the first time with what might have been genuine approval. "Now you're thinking like an Egyptian priest," he said. "Now you're playing the game at the level it was meant to be played." But what none of them knew, what even the guide might not have fully understood, was that this decision had just set in motion the events that would lead to the Templars' destruction, to the legend of the cursed 13th member, and to a betrayal that would echo through the centuries. The gods were waking. The Templars were transforming, and the Vatican was watching with growing horror, preparing for the day when they would have to destroy the monster they had inadvertently helped create. The transformation of the Knights Templar into something that was neither purely Christian nor purely pagan took place gradually over the next decade, hidden behind layers of secrecy that would have impressed the Egyptian priests who had pioneered such methods thousands of years earlier. To the outside world, the Templars remained devoted warrior monks, their reputation growing with each successful defense of Christian territories and each innovation in banking and finance. But within the innermost circles, something unprecedented in human history was taking shape, the ritual that would attempt to create what Hughes called the 13th god required preparations that consumed years. It wasn't enough to simply gather artifacts and speak incantations. What they were attempting, the fusion of Christian mysticism with Egyptian magic to create a new, divine entity, required sacrifice on a scale that would have horrified anyone who knew the full truth. You see, the Egyptian gods had been created through worship, through the focused belief and ritual practice of millions of people over thousands of years. That collective faith had given them reality, had transformed them from concepts into actual entities that existed in dimensions parallel to the physical world. To create a new god, the Templars would need to generate that same kind of focused belief and channel it into a form that could exist independently of its creators. But there was a problem. Christian theology explicitly forbade the creation of new gods. There was only one God, and attempting to create another was the ultimate heresy. The solution the Templars developed was both brilliant and deeply troubling. They would not create a new god, officially. Instead, they would create what they called an aspect of the Christian God, a face that he chose to show to those who served him through unusual means. They would worship this aspect using rituals that blended Christian prayer with Egyptian magic, and over time, through the power of focused belief and the amplification provided by their artifacts, this aspect would take on independent existence. The entity they planned to create would be protector of the Templars specifically, granting them powers beyond what any individual artifact could provide, shielding them from the attention of the Egyptian gods who sought to reclaim their worship, and most importantly, binding them together in a way that would prevent the kind of fragmentation and betrayal that had led to Russell's death. The guide, when he learned the full details of their plan, expressed something that might have been admiration mixed with concern. "You understand what you're proposing? If you succeed, you won't just have created a new god. You'll have bound yourselves to it completely. Your souls, your wills, your very identities will become extensions of this entity. You'll cease to be individuals in any meaningful sense and become cells in a larger organism. Is that really what you want?" Hugas met his gaze steadily. "Better to be part of something greater than ourselves than to remain vulnerable and divided. Better to have one master we create and control than to serve many masters who would use us for their own purposes. And yes, better to sacrifice our individual identities than to watch our order be destroyed by enemies we cannot defeat through normal means." The ritual was planned for the summer solstice of 1135, to be performed in a chamber deep beneath the Temple Mount that even the Patriarch of Jerusalem didn't know existed. 13 knights would participate, the 12 who now officially led the order, plus one more who would serve as the ritual's focus, the living vessel into which the new entity would first be born. That 13th participant was meant to be Hugas himself. As Grand Master and the driving force behind this entire plan, he believed it was his responsibility to serve as the foundation for what they were creating. But the guide had other ideas. "It cannot be you," he said flatly during the final planning session. "You're too strong-willed, too attached to your own identity. The vessel needs to be someone more ... malleable. Someone whose sense of self is weak, enough that the new entity can take root without resistance. Someone who wants desperately to be part of something greater than themselves because they know they are insufficient on their own." The implication was clear and cruel. They needed someone weak, someone who could be sacrificed, not just physically but spiritually, someone whose entire being could be overwritten by what they were creating. And the guide already had someone in mind, Brother Felipe. De Nablus was a knight who had joined the Templars 5 years earlier, after the order had already begun its transformation. He had never been particularly skilled as a warrior, never shown any aptitude for the financial and administrative work that many Templars excelled at, never demonstrated the kind of personality that would make him a leader or even a particularly notable follower. He was, in every meaningful sense, unremarkable, the kind of man who drifts through life looking for purpose and never quite finding it. But he had one quality that made him perfect for the guide's purposes. He was desperately devoted to the order. He would do anything, sacrifice anything, to prove his worth to his brothers. And when the guide approached him privately and explained, that he had been chosen for a special honor to serve as the vessel for a great working of magic that would protect the Templars forever. Felipe wept with joy at finally being given a purpose that mattered. What the guide didn't tell Felipe, what none of the 12 participating knights told him, was that the ritual would consume him entirely. His body would survive, at least initially, but everything that made Felipe who he was, his memories, his personality, his soul, would be burned away to fuel the birth of the new entity. He would become a living hollow, filled with something that wore his face but was not him in any meaningful sense. The ritual began at midnight on the longest day of the year, with the 13 knights arranged in a circle around an altar that had been carved from a single block of granite, hauled from Egypt at tremendous expense. On the altar lay every one of the most powerful artifacts the Templars had recovered: the healing ankh, the storm-summoning staff, the soul-drinking dagger, the language-understanding scarab, and a dozen others. Their combined power was meant to fuel the transformation, to provide the raw energy needed to force a new entity into existence. Felipe stood at the circle's center, naked and anointed with oils that had been prepared according to formulas found in tombs older than recorded history. Around him the 12 knights began to chant in a mixture of Latin and ancient Egyptian, their voices harmonizing in ways that human throats should not have been able to achieve. The artifacts on the altar began to glow, each with its own color and intensity, filling the chamber with light that hurt the eyes and seemed to bend in impossible directions. For 3 hours, the chanting continued, building in intensity and complexity. Felipe stood motionless at first, but as the ritual progressed, his body began to shake, not with fear or cold, but with something else, the sensation of his identity being stripped away layer by layer, like skin being flayed from muscle from bone. He tried to scream, but his voice was gone, stolen by the magic that was consuming him from the inside out. The guide stood outside the circle, watching with an expression that suggested this was going exactly as he had planned. And perhaps that should have been the Templars' first warning that something was wrong. The guide had manipulated them from the beginning, had orchestrated every major decision they had made. Why would this ritual be any different? At the moment when Philippa's transformation should have completed, when the new entity should have emerged fully formed and bound to the Templars' service, something went catastrophically wrong. The guide stepped forward and spoke a single word in a language that predated even ancient Egyptian, a sound that seemed to come from the foundations of reality itself, and Philippa's body exploded. Not literally, there was no blood, no physical destruction, but spiritually, metaphysically, the vessel that was supposed to contain the new entity shattered like glass struck with a hammer. The energy that had been building, the focused belief in magical power that was meant to birth a new god, suddenly had nowhere to go. It poured out of Philippa's destroyed soul and into the 12 knights who had been powering the ritual, flooding them with more power than any human vessel could safely contain. Some of them died instantly, their hearts simply stopping as the overload of energy fried every nerve in their bodies. Others survived but were transformed in ways that were immediately obvious and horrifying. Godfrey's eyes became solid gold, without pupils or whites, and he could no longer look at anything without seeing through it into the spiritual dimensions beyond. Andre's skin took on a translucent quality, and anyone who looked at him could see his internal organs, his bones, even the thoughts moving through his brain like fish swimming in a clear pond. Hugues himself felt something break inside his mind as the energy flooded through him. He suddenly understood why the guide had sabotaged the ritual. This had never been about creating a new god to serve the Templars. It had been about forcing the Templars themselves to become vessels for the Egyptian gods, about opening them up so completely that resistance would be impossible. "You tricked us," Hugues gasped, falling to his knees as power burned through every cell of his body. "This was never about helping us. It was always about claiming us for them." The guide's smile was terrible to see. "Oh, Hugues, you still don't understand. I didn't trick you, you tricked yourselves. Every decision you made, every artifact you took, every ritual you performed, every oath you swore, you did willingly. I simply guided you along the path you had already chosen. The Egyptian gods don't need to force worship from unwilling servants. They simply need to make the willing servants realize what they've already become." As the surviving knights writhed on the floor, their bodies and minds reshaping themselves into forms that could contain the power they had tried to wield, the guide began to speak the truth he had hidden from them for nearly 2 decades. "There never were 10 of us at that first ceremony in Jerusalem. There were only 9. I was never separate from you. I have always been what you were becoming. I am what happens when a human opens themselves fully to Egyptian magic, when they let the old gods flow through them without resistance. I am the 13th Knight, Hugues. And now so are you all." The revelation should have destroyed whatever remained of their Christian faith, should have made them understand that they had been worshipping false gods all along, that they had damned themselves beyond any hope of redemption. But something unexpected happened. As the power settled into their bodies, as they began to adjust to what they had become, the surviving knights felt something that was not entirely the Egyptian gods. The ritual had failed to create a new entity separate from them, but it had succeeded in creating a bond between them, a connection that linked their minds and souls in ways that transcended normal human understanding. They could feel each other's thoughts, share each other's memories, draw upon each other's strength. They had become, in a very real sense, a single organism distributed across multiple bodies, and that organism was not entirely controlled by the Egyptian gods. The Christian faith they had maintained, the genuine devotion to protecting pilgrims and defending the Holy Land, the brotherhood they had forged through years of fighting and surviving together, all of that had become part of the equation too. The result was something unprecedented, something that neither the guide nor the Egyptian gods had fully anticipated. A hybrid entity that was part Christian, part pagan, part human, part divine. Something that could draw upon the power of both traditions without being entirely controlled by either. Something that might actually have a chance of surviving the conflicts that were coming. But the price had been terrible. 5 of the 12 knights had died in the ritual. Philip's body survived, but was now inhabited by something that wore his face like a mask. And the 7 surviving founders were transformed into beings that could no longer pretend to be fully human. They would need to go into hiding, to recruit new members who could serve as the public face of the order while the true power operated from the shadows. They would need to create layers upon layers of secrecy, with different levels of initiation revealing different amounts of truth. They would need to become exactly the kind of secret society that conspiracy theorists would later imagine the Templars to be, and at the center of it all would be the legend of the 13th Knight, the one who was never counted, who existed outside the official structure, who had guided them into damnation while promising salvation. The guide would become that legend, his true nature hidden behind layers of mythology and misdirection. And the Templars would spend the next century trying to figure out whether they had been victims of his manipulation or willing participants in their own corruption. The answer, of course, was both, which made it so much worse. As dawn broke over Jerusalem, the surviving knights emerged from the underground chamber, looking like men who had survived a battle but lost the war. They would rebuild. They would continue. They would become one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe, but they would never be free of what they had become. And they would never forget the night when they tried to become gods and ended up as something far stranger and far more cursed. The decades following the failed ritual saw the Knights Templar transform from a religious military order into something that historians would struggle to categorize for centuries to come. On the surface, they remained devoted Christian warriors, their reputation growing with each passing year. They built castles and churches across Europe and the Holy Land. They established financial networks that made them indispensable to kings and merchants. They recruited thousands of members, most of whom had no idea what truly lay at the heart of their organization. But beneath this respectable facade, the 7 survivors of that terrible night in 1135 had created a structure of secrecy so complex that even most Templars themselves didn't understand it. There were circles within circles, levels of initiation that revealed progressively darker truths. And at the very center, hidden from everyone except the transformed founders, lay the reality of what they had become. You need to understand how thoroughly the Vatican had been watching all of this. Cardinal Matthias had died in 1140, but before his death he had compiled a report that would circulate among certain circles of the church hierarchy for generations. In it he detailed his suspicions about the Templars' involvement with Egyptian magic, his belief that something catastrophic had occurred in Jerusalem around 1135, and his conviction that the order needed to be investigated and potentially destroyed before whatever corruption infected them could spread further. But Rome was caught in an impossible position. The Templars had become too useful, too wealthy, too politically connected to simply eliminate. They provided military force that kept the Holy Land in Christian hands. They offered banking services that facilitated trade and pilgrimage. They had the favor of kings and the respect of common people. Moving against them openly would require evidence so overwhelming that even their powerful supporters couldn't ignore it, and the Templars had become very good at hiding evidence. So the Vatican chose a different strategy. They would infiltrate the Templars themselves, placing their own agents within the order at various levels, slowly building a case that could eventually justify the destruction they knew was necessary. It would take decades, perhaps even a century, but the Church had learned patience from fighting heresies that took generations to fully manifest. The first Vatican agent to successfully penetrate the inner circles of the Templars was a young French knight named Jacques de Malle. Recruited in 1265, he was intelligent, ambitious, genuinely devout, and most importantly, he possessed a quality that made him invisible to the kind of magical detection the transformed founders relied upon. The Vatican had discovered, through their own secret studies of the supernatural, that certain bloodlines carried a natural immunity to magical influence. Jacques was one such individual, and he had been trained from youth to use this immunity to investigate and undermine organizations that trafficked with forces the Church deemed demonic. Over the next 40 years, Jacques rose through the Templar ranks with calculated precision. He participated in battles, managed commanderies, demonstrated financial acumen that impressed his superiors. And all the while he observed, documented, and reported back to his handlers in Rome everything he learned about the order's true nature. What Jacques discovered horrified even the Vatican officials who had sent him. The Templars weren't just using Egyptian artifacts. They had become, in some fundamental sense, extensions of the very gods they had tried to control. The 7 surviving founders, now impossibly old, but sustained by the power flowing through them, had created a network of awakened Templars who had undergone lesser versions of the transformation ritual. These awakened members formed a secret hierarchy within the official structure, communicating through codes that were part linguistic and part telepathic, pursuing agendas that had nothing to do with Christian piety and everything to do with accumulating power that could reshape the world itself. But Jacques also discovered something that the Vatican hadn't expected: division within the Templars' hidden leadership. Not all of the transformed founders agreed about what they had become or what they should do with their power. Some, like Hugues, still clung to the belief that they could use their abilities to serve Christian purposes, that the Egyptian magic was merely a tool that could be wielded by faithful men. Others had abandoned any pretense of Christian devotion, embracing their transformation fully and seeking to expand their power without regard for church authority or moral constraints. And at the center of this conflict, still manipulating events after more than a century, was the guide. He appeared unchanged by time, looking exactly as he had in 1118 when he first approached Hugues with promises of Egyptian treasures. He moved between Templar commanderies like a shadow, offering advice that some founders followed eagerly, while others rejected with growing suspicion. And he continued to hint at larger purposes, greater plans, suggesting that the Templars' transformation was merely one step in a process that would reshape human civilization itself. Jacques' most detailed report, sent to Rome in 1291, included a disturbing observation. The one they call the guide is not what he claims to be. I have watched him for years, and I am certain now that he is not human, not in any conventional sense. He does not eat, does not sleep, shows no signs of aging. When he speaks, sometimes his shadow moves independently of his body. When he walks, sometimes his footsteps make no sound. I believe he is either a demon wearing human form, or something even more troubling, an actual manifestation of the Egyptian gods themselves, walking among us in flesh. The report concluded with a recommendation that would shape the next 2 decades of Vatican policy toward the Templars. They cannot be reformed. They cannot be reasoned with. They must be destroyed completely, root and branch, before their corruption spreads beyond the capacity of the Church to contain it. But such destruction must be executed perfectly. If we move too soon, if we leave any of the awakened members alive, they will simply rebuild in secret. We need to wait until we can strike at all their major commanderies simultaneously, until we can seize their artifacts and wealth before they can be hidden, until we can capture enough of the transformed founders that the truth about what they've become can be exposed. In 1307, that opportunity finally arrived. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars and eager to seize their wealth, approached Pope Clement V with accusations of heresy that he claimed came from former Templars who had fled the order in horror. The accusations were sensational idol worship, desecration of Christian symbols, secret rituals that involved spitting on the cross, and most damning of all, trafficking with demonic powers that granted unnatural abilities. What Philip didn't know was that many of these accusations had been fed to him by Vatican agents, including Jacques de Molay, who by now had risen to become Grand Master of the Order. Jacques had spent 4 decades building his cover, earning trust, positioning himself at the very apex of Templar leadership, and now he would use that position to betray them completely. The arrests came at dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date deliberately chosen for its numerological significance. 13, the cursed number, the number of the hidden knight, the number that had haunted the Templars since that terrible ritual in 1135, in a coordinated operation that had taken years to plan. Royal agents across France simultaneously arrested hundreds of Templars, seizing their commanderies, confiscating their wealth, and beginning interrogations that would employ the full arsenal of medieval torture techniques. But the Vatican agents had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed that the 7 transformed founders were old men, sustained by magic, but still fundamentally mortal. They believed that capturing and killing these 7 would destroy the heart of the Order's supernatural power. What they didn't understand was that the ritual that had failed to create a new god had succeeded in creating something far more difficult to destroy: a distributed consciousness that existed across multiple bodies, simultaneously. When agents raided the temple in Paris where Hugues de Payens was known to reside, they found an old man who seemed barely capable of movement, let alone resistance. They tortured him for information about the artifacts, about the other founders, about the source of the Order's power, and Hugues gave them everything they wanted to hear, confessing to worshipping demons, to practicing black magic, to betraying Christ himself. But even as Hugues's body was being broken on the rack, his consciousness was elsewhere, distributed among the other founders and the awakened Templars who had escaped the initial arrests. The pain he experienced was real, but it was also shared among so many minds that no single one of them was overwhelmed by it. And through that network of linked consciousness, he was able to warn the others, coordinate their escape, and begin the process of hiding everything that the Church must not be allowed to find. The artifacts were the first priority. Over the previous century, the Templars had accumulated hundreds of Egyptian magical objects, along with texts that explained their use and rituals that could create new ones. If the Church seized these, if they began to study and understand them, they might develop their own magical capabilities, or worse, they might accidentally trigger the very disasters The Egyptians had spent thousands of years trying to prevent. Through the distributed consciousness, the transformed founders coordinated the evacuation of artifacts from dozens of commanderies across Europe. Some were hidden in locations that would remain secret for centuries. Others were deliberately destroyed, their power released back into the dimensions from which it had originally been drawn. A few of the most dangerous items were sent far beyond the reach of European civilization, to Africa, to Asia, even across the ocean to lands that Europeans had barely begun to explore. But there was one artifact that could not be moved or destroyed. The altar in the chamber beneath the Temple Mount, the place where the ritual had been performed, had become something more than mere stone. Decades of magical workings had transformed it into a focal point, a place where the boundaries between dimensions were permanently weakened. Destroying it would risk opening rifts that could unleash forces no human agency could control. Leaving it intact risked the Church discovering it and using it for their own purposes. The solution the founders devised was desperate and brilliant. They would seal the chamber so completely that finding it would become impossible, using methods that combined Egyptian magic with architectural techniques that wouldn't be understood for centuries. Then they would create false chambers, decoy sites that investigators would find and believe were the real locations of Templar magical workings. And finally, they would plant evidence in these decoy sites, evidence that would lead the Church to believe the Templars had been far less sophisticated in their magical practices than they truly were. The guide appeared one final time during these preparations, materializing in a hidden chamber where the remaining free founders had gathered. He looked at them with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been regret. It was impossible to tell with his alien features. "You've done better than I expected," he said. "When I first approached Hugis all those years ago, I thought you would last perhaps a few decades before destroying yourselves. But you've survived for nearly 2 centuries. And now you're positioned to survive even this purge. Some of you will die, yes. Many of you will be tortured and executed. But the core of what you become will persist, hidden within other organizations, waiting for the time when humanity is ready to reclaim the Egyptian legacy properly." Hugis, his physical body still on the rack in Paris, but his consciousness, speaking through another founder's mouth, asked the question that had haunted him for 200 years. "What are you really? You're not human. You're not exactly a god. What are you?" The guide's smile was sad. "I am what you were supposed to become if the ritual had succeeded. I am a human who transformed himself so completely into a vessel for Egyptian magic that his original identity was entirely erased. I was a priest in Egypt 3,000 years ago, and I performed the same ritual you attempted. But I did it correctly, with proper preparation and understanding. And the result was this immortality of a sort, but at the cost of everything that made me who I was. I don't remember my original name. I don't remember what I looked like before the transformation. I am simply the guide, the one who helps others walk the path I walked, in the hope that someday someone will do it better than I did." It was the most human moment any of them had ever seen from him, and it made his betrayal, his manipulation of them into becoming monsters, somehow more tragic rather than less. "Will we see you again?" one of the other founders asked. "Perhaps," the guide replied. "In a few centuries, when the memory of the Templars has faded into legend, When new seekers begin to ask the same questions you asked, I will find them as I found you, and I will guide them as I guided you, because that is what I am. That is all I am. He vanished then, dissolving into shadows that shouldn't have existed in a chamber lit by torches. The founders never saw him again, but his influence would persist, woven into the very fabric of the secret societies that would emerge in the centuries to come, all of them searching for the Egyptian mysteries that the Templars had found and lost. The purge continued for 7 more years, claiming hundreds of lives and destroying the Templars as a public institution. But the secret, the power, the knowledge, those survived, hidden in places and forms that the Church never suspected, and the legend of the 13th Knight was born, growing with each retelling until it became something far larger than the truth it was meant to conceal. The final chapter of the Knights Templar as a public institution ended on March 18, 1314, when Jacques de Molay, the man who had spent his entire adult life infiltrating and betraying the order, stood before the flames that would consume him. But the story you've been told about his execution, about his curse upon the Pope and the King, about his declaration of innocence, that was theater, carefully orchestrated to create a legend that would obscure the deeper truth. You see, Jacques had made one fatal miscalculation in his decades of service to the Vatican. He had believed that by positioning himself as Grand Master, by appearing to be the ultimate authority within the Templars, he could control the final act of their destruction. What he didn't understand until far too late was that the real power had never resided in the Grand Master. It had always been distributed among the transformed founders, the awakened members, the network of consciousness that stretched across Europe and beyond. The night before his execution, Jacques received a visitor in his cell. The guards saw nothing. They had been influenced by subtle magics that made them forget the moments when the cell door opened and closed. But Jacques, immune to magical influence, saw the guide clearly as he materialized from shadows that shouldn't have existed in a locked stone chamber. "You've done well," the guide said, and his voice carried none of the warmth such praise should hold. "You've destroyed the visible Templars, scattered their wealth, forced them underground. The Vatican believes it has won, and King Philip celebrates his plunder. But you know the truth, don't you, Jacques? You've been reporting to Rome for 40 years. You've documented everything you discovered about what the Templars became. So tell me, do you really believe you've destroyed us?" Jacques met his gaze with the defiance of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I've destroyed your public face. I've seized your artifacts, most of them, anyway. I've forced you to scatter and hide. That's victory enough." The guide's laughter was soft and terrible. "You've seized decoys and lesser items. The real artifacts, the ones that matter, were moved years before you ordered the arrests. As for scattering us, we were already scattered by design. You didn't force us into hiding. You simply confirmed what we already knew, that we could never operate openly in a world ruled by the Church's narrow vision of truth." He moved closer, and Jacques found himself unable to look away from those ancient eyes. "But I'm not here to gloat about your failure. I'm here to offer you something that should terrify you, the truth about what you've really accomplished. What the guide revealed in that cell would never be recorded in any official history. He explained that the Templars' destruction had been necessary, even desired by some of the transformed founders. The order had grown too large, too public, too corrupted by members who joined for wealth and power rather than understanding. The purge would eliminate the dross, leaving only those who truly comprehended what they had become. More importantly, the persecution would create a legend far more powerful than the reality had ever been. Future generations would speak of the Templars as guardians of ancient secrets, possessors of mystical knowledge, victims of a conspiracy by church and crown. That legend would attract seekers who would form new organizations, would search for the hidden wisdom, would eventually find fragments of what the Templars had discovered. And when they did, the guide would be there, as he had always been, ready to lead them down the same path. "You think you've destroyed us," the guide said, "but you've actually ensured our immortality. The Knights Templar will never die now, they'll live forever in legend, far more powerful as a myth than they ever were as a reality, and that myth will draw the ambitious, the curious, the desperate, generation after generation. Some of them will find what they're looking for, and when they do, the cycle will begin again." Jacques wanted to deny it, wanted to believe that his life's work had meant something, but he could see the truth in the guide's inhuman eyes. The Templars hadn't been defeated, they had been transformed once again, from an organization into an idea, from a historical reality into an eternal symbol. "Why tell me this?" Jacques asked. "Why not let me die believing I'd succeeded? Because tomorrow, when they burn you, you're going to curse the Pope and the King. You're going to declare your innocence, and the innocence of the Templars. You're going to create a legend that will last for centuries. And you're going to do it because I'm asking you to, because even now, even knowing what you know, you'll choose to serve the story rather than die in silence." The guide was right, of course. When the flames rose the next day, when the heat became unbearable and death approached, Jacques de Molay shouted his famous curse. He called upon God to summon both Pope Clement and King Philip to divine judgment within a year. He proclaimed the innocence of the Templars and the injustice of their persecution, and thousands of witnesses heard his words and believed them, creating a legend that would inspire conspiracy theories and secret societies for 700 years. What those witnesses didn't see was the guide, standing in the crowd with a face that looked different to everyone who glanced at him, watching with satisfaction as the final piece of his plan fell into place. The Templars were dead as an institution, but as an idea, as a symbol, as a legend that would never die, they were more powerful than ever. The curse seemed to work. Pope Clement died within a month, King Philip within the year. Whether this was coincidence, assassination by surviving Templars, or genuine supernatural intervention remains unclear, even now. But the effect was undeniable. The legend grew, spread, became embedded in European consciousness as a cautionary tale about the dangers of power and the corruption of institutions. And in the centuries that followed, the guide's prediction proved accurate. Secret societies emerged claiming connection to Templar wisdom, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, dozens of others. Some found genuine fragments of what the Templars had hidden. Others created elaborate fantasies based on rumors and speculation. But all of them perpetuated the idea that ancient knowledge existed, waiting to be recovered by those worthy enough to seek it. The transformed founders, those who survived the purge, lived on in ways that would have seemed impossible to ordinary humans. Some maintained single identities across centuries, appearing to die and be replaced by descendants who were actually the same consciousness in new bodies. Others fragmented further, distributing themselves across multiple simultaneous vessels, experiencing the world through dozens of perspectives at once. And all of them continued to search for the understanding that had eluded them how to wield Egyptian power without being consumed by it, how to serve both Christian faith and pagan magic, how to become something new without losing what they had been. By the time the 20th century arrived, the last of the original founders had finally allowed his physical forms to die, his consciousness diffusing into the collective unconscious of humanity itself. The artifacts remained hidden in locations, scattered across the globe, waiting for hands that would never find them or shouldn't touch them. The secret of what the Templars had really become was buried under layers of legend, so thick that truth and fiction had become indistinguishable. But the guide remained, still appearing to those who asked the right questions, still offering knowledge, to those who demonstrated the courage or foolishness to seek it, still walking the earth in a body that had ceased to be human millennia ago, because that was his curse, not death, but eternal existence as a tool for forces that predated human civilization, forever guiding seekers toward transformations they didn't understand and couldn't control. And the 13th Knight? That legend took on a life of its own. Some claimed he was the betrayer who had sold out his brothers. Others said he was the wisest of them all, who had foreseen the Order's destruction and prepared for it. A few whispered that he was still alive, waiting in the shadows for the time when the Templars would rise again. All of these stories were true in their way, and all of them were false, because the 13th Knight was never one person. He was the shadow that falls across any organization that seeks power beyond human limits. The price that must be paid when mortal men try to wield divine forces. The reminder that some doors, once open, can never be closed again. The Vatican keeps its own records, locked in archives that few have ever seen. In those documents, scattered across centuries of investigation and speculation, there are references to the Templars that don't match public history, reports of sightings of men who should have been dead for centuries, accounts of artifacts that display properties no medieval technology could explain, warnings about organizations that claim Templar heritage and might actually possess some fragment of what was lost, and in the deepest vaults, in documents that even most cardinals are forbidden to read, there is a file marked with the number 13. It contains everything the Church knows and suspects about what the Templars really found, what they really became, and what might still be waiting in the hidden places where their legacy was buried. That file ends with a single sentence, written in a hand that matches no known scribe. They are not gone. They are simply elsewhere, and elseone waiting. The Knights Templar fell on Friday the 13th, and that date became synonymous with bad luck across the Western world. But perhaps the real curse wasn't on those who destroyed them. It was on those who survived, condemned to exist forever as something between human and God, never fully one or the other, always seeking but never finding the transformation they had desired. Sleep now, and let this knowledge settle into the deeper parts of your mind. Tomorrow, if you see a stranger whose face you cannot quite remember, whose words carry meanings beyond their surface sense, whose shadow seems to move independently of their body, You'll know you've met the guide, and you'll have to decide whether to listen to his promises of power and ancient wisdom, or to walk away while you still can dot the choice, as it has always been, is yours. But remember, once you touch the artifacts of Egypt, once you speak the words that were old when Rome was young, once you let the ancient powers flow through you, you can never go back to being merely human. The 13th Knight is waiting. He's always waiting, and he has all the time in the world.